Welcome back viewers into Dr. Raktim Mukherjee's Biological Sciences. We are dealing with immunology. This is the second video in the series. In the earlier video, we have already briefed ourselves regarding the immunology of inflammation, the biochemical mechanisms, the steps involved in elimination of pathogen, role of bradykinin on mast cell, the nerve ending, opening of calcium channels, and how exactly the pathogen gets eliminated. But those were all responses of your acute inflammatory process. In this video, we shall brief ourselves regarding the process of chronic inflammation. So what exactly is chronic inflammation? First of all, let's see the diagram. Some of the key aspects. I would use the word over here, infiltration. Infiltration. So you have infiltration of macrophages. I will write in short form M5, that is macrophage. So let's see what happens in chronic inflammation. Chronic inflammation is a very slow process, unlike acute inflammation, which is a very fast process which can even kill a person. Chronic inflammation is a slow process. It involves the formation of new connective tissues, and these new connective tissues are detrimental for the host. The chronic inflammation causes permanent tissue damage. It causes permanent tissue damage. So if chronic inflammation is not taken care, it will lead to a permanent tissue damage. And mind you students, chronic inflammation or prolonged inflammation is against the persistent stimuli. There should be a stimuli which persists, a stimulus or stimuli that persists for extended duration of time. So I will put it as stimuli that persists for extended duration of time that causes the chronic inflammation. It has a very complex immunological mechanism. We will see to it later. But before that, as I said, there is a dense infiltration of lymphocytes and macrophages at the site of inflammation. So which are the cell types that undergo infiltration? One is lymphocyte, another is the macrophages. These are the cell types that undergo the infiltration. Where? At the site of inflammation. So it leads to the formation of granuloma. This granuloma will wall off the area, form when the phagocytic cells don't destroy the pathogen. Try to understand, I will explain. So this is your pathogen P, this is another pathogen P1, this is P2, this is the third pathogen P3, and the granuloma formation takes place. So there comes a phagocyte. We have already studied phagocytosis. There comes a phagocyte. This phagocyte comes with the intention of destroying these pathogens P1, P2 and P3. But because of some reason, they cannot destroy. In other words, since they cannot destroy, the pathogen will be alive, but only thing is that a wall will be created across the pathogen. This is the wall W and this is P is the pathogen. So this is how the chronic inflammation results. How the initiation of chronic inflammation takes place. As I said, the persistent stimuli will be there. The persistent stimuli can be, what are the types of persistent stimuli? The persistent stimuli, can be of various types. One is infection. Second can be autoimmune disease. Third, it can be antigen or foreign bodies. These are all the cases of persistent stimuli. Because of this persistent stimuli, there will be macrophage activation. Macrophage activation. There are two types of macrophage, students. There are two types of macrophage. One is M1, first type, and another is M2, the second type. Remember, students, whenever you talk about inflammation, especially chronic inflammation, it is the M1 macrophages which are responsible for inflammation. M1 macrophages are involved in inflammation. So apart from that, there is a role of cytokines also. Students, my next video will be on cytokines, but before that I would like to tell you there are two types of cytokines. One is the pro-inflammatory cytokines, another is anti-inflammatory cytokines. Whenever you talk about pro-inflammatory cytokines, they are responsible for chronic inflammation. This is often asked in short question. Enlist the various pro-inflammatory cytokines which help in chronic inflammation or inflammation per se. Your answer would be, the first one is TNF alpha. Another pro-inflammatory cytokine is interleukin 1 beta, and third is the interleukin 6. These are all the cytokines. These are the various cytokines. I won't say they are pro-inflammatory or anti-inflammatory at this stage, but these are the cytokines that are involved in chronic inflammation. My next point is immune cells in chronic inflammation. That is our next point. What is the role of immune cells in chronic inflammation? Okay, so which are the immune cells? First of all, immune cells infiltrate. So we have already seen the diagram, and two things happen. One is infiltration, another is proliferation. These are the two things that happen. Now, which are the immune cells involved in chronic inflammation? First and the foremost are the CD4 positive T cells. CD4 positive T cells, again two types. One is Th1 and second one is Th17. These are the two types of T cells. They are involved in chronic inflammation. Apart from that, you also have the involvement of B cells. So which are the cells they are involved? One is CD4 positive T cells. Which CD4 positive T cells? Both variants, Th1 and Th17. Along with that, even the B cells are also involved in chronic inflammation. Then there is involvement of what we have seen in acute inflammation. You also have involvement of neutrophils. What the neutrophils do? In chronic inflammation, there is sustained recruitment. There will be sustained recruitment of the neutrophils. There will be sustained recruitment. The neutrophils will be recruited for a sustained duration. I mean, the neutrophils will keep on coming on and on and on, and more neutrophils will be sent to the site of injury. That is sustained recruitment. Apart from that, there is another role of macrophages. macrophage. Especially which type of macrophage? The macrophage activation would take place, and initially it will be M1. Obviously, why M1? Because inflammation is caused by M1. Later on, you know, inflammation cannot be allowed for an extended duration of time. Later on, it will be M2. M2 will help in resolution or cessation of inflammation. So these are the cell types that are involved, and M2, M1 was for inflammation, M2 is for tissue repair which takes place after inflammation. The next point that I would like to discuss, mediators and consequences. Mediators and consequences, we need to ascertain some of the points that we have already covered under innate immunity. So I will put numerical form and write all the mediators. The first and the foremost mediators is ROS or reactive oxygen species. Second mediator is nitric oxide, that is NO. The third mediator, of course, is proteases. Proteases help in tissue remodeling, and the fourth mediator we have already covered earlier in acute inflammation are prostaglandins, especially the two variants PGE2 and PGF2 alpha. These are the mediators. So what the mediators do? Mediators will do irreversible tissue damage. Also, I will put it as collateral tissue damage. When I say collateral tissue damage, it means this damage is permanent. It cannot be sorted, and it will never be able to recover again, unlike acute inflammation. Further consequences, you have growth of connective tissues, that is fibrosis. Again, it will cause tissue remodeling, and because of all this, when a patient is having chronic inflammation for years together, the last consequences would be organ dysfunction. Organ dysfunction. Now, in the next section, we will study how inflammation is resolved. So now we will discuss the resolution of chronic inflammation. First of all, try to understand this resolution of chronic inflammation is a active process. Active process. This involves some of the pro-resolving mediators. The pro-resolving mediators will be called as SPMs. There is a macrophage switch. We all know which macrophage was responsible for inflammation. Your answer would be M1. But now we don't want inflammation to continue. It should be switched off. So there is a switching off of macrophages from M1 to M2. Once this switching off takes place, the inflammation, the chronic inflammation is stopped. So this is how the resolution takes place, and after resolution, whatever injury has taken place, those tissue, there will be tissue healing because of the resolution. Now, before we go to the next portion, some of the examples. we deal with some of the examples involved in chronic inflammation. What are some of the classical examples of chronic inflammation? Some of the areas will be covered by Chandni madam as well in her autoimmunity lecture. So we have examples. First example is RA, rheumatoid arthritis. It's an autoimmune disease where the immune cell attacks the synovium, leading to damage. The next example is atherosclerosis, chronic inflammation of the blood vessel. Then you have IBD. IBD stands for inflammatory bowel disease, and chronic lung disease, that is COPD, the chronic lung disease. And chronic lung disease also leads to asthma. Okay, these are some of the examples. Now, last but not the least, some of the therapeutic aspects. What are some of the therapeutic aspects? You can go for diet, lifestyle management. You can take anti-inflammatory drugs such as non-steroidal NSAIDs, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. You can go for corticosteroids, that is steroidals. And before we end our talk, something from which I have adapted from Kubi's latest edition, the chronic inflammation. You can see there can be infectious causes and non-infectious causes. Infectious causes, unresolved infection which has not been completely cured, or it can be gut microbiome, that is intestinal microbes. Then you have non-infectious causes. The non-infectious causes can be hyperglycemia, that is excess circulating blood sugar, autoimmune diseases, allergic responses, organ transplantation, cancer. These all will lead to chronic inflammation. We have already seen chronic inflammation leads to the cytokines involved, IL-6, TNF alpha, IL-1 beta, interleukin 18, interleukin 17. They will cause tissue changes such as cell death, the fibrosis, the blood vessel growth, that is angiogenesis, new blood vessel growth, cell proliferation. It can also lead to metabolic changes such as the changes in insulin signaling, which can lead to type 2 diabetes, and some of the systemic conditions that we discussed: atherosclerosis, organ failure, cancer, Alzheimer's, autoimmune disease, anti-inflammatory disease, IBDs or inflammatory bowel disease, allergic condition, asthma, and organ transplant or rejection. To summarize, infection can cause chronic inflammation. Continuous microbial invasion can cause chronic inflammation, such as gum disease, when your wounds are not healed for extended duration. Failure of tolerance mechanism to gut microbes. Some microbes are ineffectively cleared, and when you are not completely clearing the microbes, it can again lead to the chronic inflammation. There can be also fungal and mycobacterial infection leading to chronic inflammation. So some of the pathogens which causes chronic inflammation: bacteria, fungi, histoplasmosis, coccidioidomyces, helminthes such as the protozoans, the large antigen antibody complexes which causes rheumatoid arthritis. And before we end, some snippets of mycobacterium and leprosy. These mycobacterial infections and leprosy is always one of the major reasons behind chronic inflammation. The cell walls have very high lipid and wax content. They are resistant to phagocytosis and intracellular killing. It will survive within the macrophages. Once it survives within the macrophage, it will be similar to protozoan pathogens such as Leishmania. Some of the bacteria will produce toxins these toxins will lead to tissue damaging reactions even after bacterial death. Finally, to summarize, this is again adapted from Kubi's immunology. These are the 4 steps. Step 1, a complex sequence of events: redness, swelling, heat, pain, loss of function, that is functio lasae. Acute inflammation leads to response to tissue damage. Chronic inflammation, we studied now, is arthritis and wasting of a disease. You have 4 steps: initially vasodilation followed by vasoconstriction, more and more blood flow causes tissue permeability. Because of tissue permeability, we come to the second step. The permeable capillaries will allow influx of fluid and exudate to the cells. This exudate will lead to the third step, that is phagocytes will migrate to the site of inflammation, that is chemotaxis. It leads to extravasation of neutrophil from the capillary or blood vessel to the site of infection, and finally after it reaches to the site of infection, the phagocytes will destroy the bacteria, that is annihilation of the pathogen. So that concludes the entire summary of inflammation, especially our today's video on chronic inflammation. Thank you very much for your kind attention.